Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 176, The Quote-Unquote Emperor. When Ricimer arrested and executed the Emperor Majorian in August 461, it is entirely likely that he didn't think it would be that big of a deal. Sure, it might be a little scandalous, but as PR problems go, it would almost certainly blow over. After all, Ricimer was the real power behind the throne. Everyone knew it, so it wasn't like this was a coup or something. More like a CEO firing his COO. But Ricimer underestimated the popularity of Majorian. Living in Italy and surrounded by a bunch of Italian aristocrats who had soured on the emperor, it might have seemed to Ricimer like the whole empire hated Majorian and was ready for him to go. But this was not so. Majorian's policies may have been ticking off Ricimer and the Italian nobility, but that did not mean that they were ticking off anyone else. So when Majorian was killed, these anyone else's were shocked and angry, and as we're about to see, they were not going to take it lying down. Two of these anyone else's are of particular interest. The first was the general I mentioned last week, the guy whose name I told you to remember. Do you remember his name? That's right, it's Aegidius. Aegidius had risen up through the ranks with Majorian, and as you'll recall, one of Majorian's first acts as emperor was to make Aegidius Magister Militum, the commander-in-chief of Gaul. Aegidius had then spent 4 years repacifying the region and getting it back under the thumb of the central imperial government. That mission was about to take an ironic twist. Aegidius was up in northern Gaul in 461 when word reached him that his old friend Majorian had been killed. Now, I don't know if Aegidius's reaction to Ricimer's coup took the form of a dramatic declaration, or if it was just passive-aggressive cold shouldering, but the minute Majorian's head hit the ground, Aegidius stopped taking orders from Italy. The general who had just spent 4 years reminding everyone he came across that the imperial government was still the legal sovereign, and as such fealty was not a suggestion, but a duty, yeah, that guy is declaring his independence from Ravenna. And this would not turn out to be a short-lived thing. Historians will wind up calling the territory Aegidius controlled in northern Gaul the domain of Soissons, named after the modern French city of Soissons, that stands roughly at the center of Aegidius's little kingdom. The domain would continue on as a quasi-Roman rump state even after the fall of the Western Empire, until this last little outpost of Roman order was finally overrun by the Franks in 486. Well, okay, said Ricimer. We've got a rogue general up in Gaul refusing to take orders. That's not such a big deal. I can handle that. But that was not all Ricimer was up against. Another of Majorian's generals, a man named Marcellinus, had exactly the same reaction to Ricimer's coup as Aegidius. Marcellinus was in control of Dalmatia, which at this point in history had drifted back into the western orbit, though when Majorian died, Marcellinus was in Sicily. He had been in place there to help run one arm of Majorian's planned invasion of North Africa, the invasion that had stalled when Majorian's Spanish fleet had been sunk by the Vandals. But when Marcellinus found out that the emperor was dead, he booked it back to his home territory double time. And when he got there, he found out that Ricimer had already tried to bribe the Dalmatian garrisons, mostly Hun mercenaries, out from under Marcellinus, which, as you can imagine, did not go over too well with Marcellinus. So like his colleague Aegidius up in Gaul, Marcellinus simply stopped taking orders from Italy. But unlike Aegidius, who was wedged between a failing empire, some barbarian kingdoms, and the English Channel, Marcellinus was wedged in between the two halves of the empire. So rather than declaring de facto independence, Marcellinus simply turned east, wrote to Leo in Constantinople and said, hey, this guy Ricimer just overthrew the guy you yourself recognize to be the lawful emperor. I'm not going to follow him anymore, but I'd be happy to follow you. So consider this my declaration of defection. But this was not all Ricimer was now up against. Although most of his problems were caused by people ticked off about his little coup, yet another problem was caused by a guy who was not so much ticked off as excited about the opportunity the coup presented. And here we are talking about our old friend King Genseric of the Vandals. Now, before I go on, I would like to say that it sort of feels like Genseric has been around forever. He first showed up back in 428 AD, which was 8 episodes back when we were talking about the rise of Aetius. And now here he is 33 years later, still going strong. So he's got to be getting old, right? Like, pretty soon we're going to be dealing with a new king of the Vandals, right? Wrong. The dude is going to outlive the Western Empire. He isn't going to die until January 477, at the age of 88, and after having ruled for almost 50 years. Which is just, way to go, Genseric. So anyway, King Genseric, who was by a healthy margin now the senior statesman of the Western Empire, and father-in-law of the imperial princess Eudoxia the Younger, took the death of Majorian as an opportunity to influence who would be chosen as his successor. The man Genseric backed was a senator by the name of Anicius Olybrius. Why Anicius Olybrius? Well, because he was married to Placidia, the other imperial princess currently enjoying the hospitality of the Vandals. Once nearly engaged to Majorian, and then formally engaged to Aetius' son, Placidia had finally wound up married to Senator Olybrius shortly after the murder of her father, Valentinian III. Though I don't believe there's any firm proof to this one way or the other, it is supposed that Olybrius was related to Valentinian's executioner/successor, Petronius Maximus. You'll recall that when Maximus seized power, he tried to give his new, and ultimately short-lived, regime the veneer of legitimacy by marrying the imperial widow Licinia Eudoxia, and then marrying the younger Eudoxia to his son. It is supposed that Olybrius was a cousin or something of Maximus's, and his marriage to Placidia was a part of this larger legitimacy project. But so far, the marriage had not really amounted to anything. Olybrius had been in Constantinople when Genseric sacked Rome, and then spirited away his new bride, so it's not like the two could have spent much time around one another. But because he was in Constantinople when Maximus fell, Olybrius managed to survive the regime change. And then, because he remained in the East in a state of semi-exile, he managed to live through the next regime change as well. So when Ricimer initiated the third regime change in 6 years, Olybrius was still alive, still married to Placidia, and, since he had been living in Constantinople for half a decade, on fairly good terms with Leo and the court of the East. When word came that Majorian was dead, Genseric stepped forward and boldly proclaimed that Senator Olybrius was the only man in the empire with any kind of legitimate claim to the imperial throne. A husband of the unjustly deposed Theodosian family, he would return honor and dignity and blah, blah, blah. The bottom line is that Olybrius was now as much a part of Genseric's family as he was a Theodosian family, so Genseric wanting him on the throne of the West was a no-brainer. But Ricimer wasn't having this for a second. If the problem with Majorian had been that Ricimer couldn't sufficiently control him, then there was no way the general was going to accept Olybrius, who would be part creature of the Vandals and part creature of Constantinople. Plus, Olybrius's legitimacy was going to flow from his marriage to Placidia, rather than from the patronage of Ricimer. So in Ricimer's mind, I doubt there was a worse candidate for the throne than Olybrius. Genseric stepped up the pressure by intensifying Vandal raids on the Italian coast, promising to shut them down only if Olybrius was elevated, but Ricimer refused to budge. After a 3-month interregnum, Ricimer finally found a candidate more to his liking. Someone dull, weak-willed, and entirely dependent on Ricimer. Enter Libius Severus. Dull, weak-willed, entirely dependent on Ricimer, Libius Severus. We know almost nothing about the new would-be emperor until he suddenly appears in Ravenna accepting the diadem in November of 461. Not that it really matters. Libius Severus is not exactly the linchpin of Roman history. During the reign of Majorian, Ricimer may have fancied himself the power behind the throne, but it's pretty clear that Majorian himself, and a good number of other people, considered it to be more of a partnership. With the elevation of Severus, though, this ambiguity was gone. Ricimer was the power behind the throne. These are the years where you have references to King Ricimer. Not references mocking his hubris, mind you, but just straight-up references to King Ricimer, because that's basically what he now was. As I mentioned a few episodes back, the famous historian J.B. Barrie once said that Ricimer was the link between Stilicho and Odoacer, and was the first German to be virtual king of Italy. Now, 15 years down the road, we're going to have a real German king of Italy, and the pro forma nature of Odoacer's seizure of power finds its roots here in the days of Ricimer, who, during these years, went so far as to possibly coin money in his own name. We're not 100% sure that he coined money in his own name, but there are good reasons to believe that he did. And I think it's telling that if it turns out to be true, no one is going to be surprised in the slightest. The elevation of Severus was, of course, only really recognized in Italy, and so King Ricimer's power did not really extend that far. Up in Gaul, Aegidius was essentially in revolt, as was Marcellinus in Dalmatia. The Eastern Augustus Leo, for his part, never recognized Severus, though for the moment he was not looking to make or break relations with the West over the issue of Majorian's murder and Severus's elevation. Now, Marcellinus was apparently prepared to storm Italy as soon as the spring of 462 arrived and asked for Leo's support, but the Eastern Emperor refused to give it, instead counseling patience. Not wanting to make any bold moves without Constantinople's backing, Marcellinus took the counsel and sat on his hands. But he was done taking orders from Ricimer. The de facto king's first concern, though, was the situation in Gaul. If he tried to attack Marcellinus first, he might incur the wrath of Leo. So better to settle the north before worrying about the east. But if he wanted to maintain his iron grip on Italy, Ricimer knew he couldn't go marching off to retake Gaul himself. He needed to find a capable subordinate to do the job for him. Now, he couldn't send the quote-unquote Emperor Severus. Not only was he likely thoroughly inexperienced in military affairs, but sending an emperor off to win back Gaul had almost certainly been one of the keys to the breakdown in the relationship between Majorian and Ricimer. Majorian had been starting to forge an independent power base for himself, and we can't have that. Better to find some suitably motivated underling and send him off to get the job done. Ricimer had the perfect candidate in an old soldier named Agrippinus. What recommended Agrippinus for the job? Well, for starters, he had been Avitus's Magister Militum for Gaul, which meant that he was the one who had been replaced by Aegidius when Majorian came to power. But the fun did not stop there. A native of Gaul himself, Agrippinus had not gone quietly into that good night, nor had Aegidius given him any reason to. Eventually, the feud between the two men led Aegidius to accuse Agrippinus of treason. Sent down to Rome to stand for his crime, Agrippinus was found guilty and sentenced to death. He managed to escape his captivity, however, and then seek asylum in the old St. Peter's, where he remained until he was officially pardoned. The details of all this are, of course, really vague, but the assumption is that the official pardon came after the death of Majorian, round about the time Ricimer was looking for someone to lead the effort to repacify Gaul and defeat the rebel Aegidius. And what better man to lead that effort than Agrippinus, who had lost his job and then very nearly lost his life to Aegidius. When Agrippinus reached Gaul sometime in 462, he did exactly the same thing Majorian had done when he entered Gaul back in 458. He made a beeline for the Goths. But unlike Majorian, who was looking to defeat and repacify the Goths, Agrippinus was looking to befriend and re-empower them. And when he arrived in Aquitaine, he found the Goths very receptive to the imperial proposals, because said proposals promised the Goths something they had been hankering for since they first put down roots in Gaul, a Mediterranean port to call their very own. In exchange for Goth support in a campaign against Aegidius, the quote-unquote Emperor Severus was willing to cede them the city of Narbonne. The Goth king Theodoric II jumped at this offer. All those battles between his father, Theodoric the Elder, and Aetius back in the day had been all about trying to win a Mediterranean port for the Goths. And now the Romans were just going to hand one over in exchange for what? Beating down a few rebels? Well, sign us up. We'll be there. But Aegidius was not leading some ramshackle band of ne'er-do-wells. You'll recall that, as I just mentioned, the little rump state Aegidius founded was going to outlast the Western Empire. Well, if it's going to outlast the Western Empire, there isn't really room in the story for a crushing defeat at the hands of Agrippinus and the Goths. I mean, maybe there is, but that would become a pretty complicated story. Lucky for us, they decided to keep things nice and simple. Agrippinus and a Goth army marched north. Aegidius heard they were coming and drew his line at Orleans. The two sides met in battle at some point in late 462, and Aegidius emerged victorious. Agrippinus and the Goths then fled, and though I have no idea what ultimately happened to him, that's the last we're going to hear from Agrippinus. Whether he died in the battle or simply faded into obscurity, no idea. He just drops off the face of the earth. This nice and simple story is only complicated by one small matter. Aegidius had not been idle since the death of Majorian, nor was he blind to the fact that pretty soon Ricimer would be coming for him. So he made a sort of mutual defense pact with the Franks. This pact obviously came into force when the Goths started marching north, and though Frankish support was likely the difference between victory and defeat for Aegidius, it was also likely the difference between victory and total victory. It seems that once they had the Goths on the run, the various Frank nobles fell into squabbling amongst themselves about who knows what, shutting down any chance Aegidius had of really crushing the Goths once and for all. Had the Franks held it together, it is possible that Aegidius could have made what was left of the Goths into his personal vassals. Then, between his alliance with the Franks, his mastery over the Goths, and his control over the rest of Gaul, well, he might well have marched into Italy and overthrown Ricimer. Get Marcellinus on board with that plan, you invade Italy from the east while I invade from the north, and Ricimer and his quote-unquote emperor don't stand a chance. But instead, Aegidius' army got vapor-locked at Orleans, and though Aegidius would never lose his domain in northern Gaul, neither would he ever expand it. While this drama was unfolding in the north, Ricimer was kept busy by Genseric and the Vandals, who were not taking his failure to elevate Libius lightly. Throughout 462 and then into 463 and 464 and 465, the Vandals continued to harass the Italian coastline, hitting and running and staying and fighting and then sailing off again before popping up here and then there and then here again. The new fleet built by Majorian was maybe somewhat effective, but it clearly wasn't the silver bullet the Romans were looking for to shut down the Vandals. Plus, Genseric was now moving forward with an ever more ambitious political program. Above and beyond his stated goal that Libius ought to be Emperor of the West, Genseric now began to make very Attila the Hun-esque claims on Roman property. After all, his son Huneric had married Eudoxia the Younger, so wasn't he entitled to some kind of dowry? Now, Genseric was not so bold as to demand half the Western Empire as Attila had, but he did claim a good chunk of the personal fortune controlled by the emperors, which he further claimed had been stolen by Ricimer and his ilk. That fortune belonged to the imperial women under his charge, or at the very least, their husbands, not a bunch of thugs who murdered Valentinian III. That Ricimer didn't have anything to do with Valentinian's death was immaterial. The Theodosian family fortune belonged to the Theodosian family. It was just that simple. Now, these sorts of legalistic arguments fell on deaf ears in the West. It's not like Ricimer was going to just hand over the imperial fortune to Genseric and the exiled princesses. So it seems reasonable to assume that these arguments were mostly directed at Constantinople. Genseric was well aware of the fact that Leo was not recognizing the legitimacy of Severus, which meant that there would probably, eventually, be some sort of effort to remove him. When that day came, Genseric wanted to make sure that his own demands were on record. Plus, he wanted to make it super obvious to everyone what the price for his help in any push to dislodge Ricimer and Severus was going to be. But Leo was in no hurry to go to war with Ricimer, even if Italy was increasingly politically, economically, and militarily isolated. So the simmering tensions of the early 460s hit a nice equilibrium. Skirmishing, jockeying, and maneuvering amongst the fractured power centers of the West ruled the day, with no one really taking anyone else down or suddenly grabbing up more territory. Even the death of Aegidius in 464 did not disrupt things too much. Whether he died naturally or was poisoned by enemies within the Frankish kingdom is unknown. Both stories are reported, but everyone reports that he was simply succeeded by his son, who continued the independent rule of his father, and who would continue this independent rule until he and what was left of his little Roman kingdom were overrun by the Franks in 486. This new equilibrium further survived an even more potentially transformative death in 465. During that summer, the quote-unquote Emperor Severus apparently died of natural causes. There is some dark hinting that Ricimer did him in, but there is little reason to believe this story. We have no idea how old Severus was when he died, but he was allowed to call himself emperor for 4 years. His death would do little to impact the wider political and military dynamics of the Mediterranean world, a testament to just how insignificant he was. He was so insignificant, in fact, that following his death, the West was going to get a sneak preview of what the political order of the future was going to be. Ricimer had stalled for months before picking a new emperor after the deposition of Avitus, and then stalled for months again after the execution of Majorian, testing the waters to perhaps see what would happen if he just left the office vacant. Next week, Ricimer will wade out even further into the post-imperial waters. After the death of Severus, the German general will refuse to elevate a successor, and then keep on refusing to elevate a successor for 2 full years, until finally Leo had to step in and put an end to this unprecedented interregnum. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode 177, The Burning Ships. In the summer of 465, the quote-unquote Emperor Libius Severus died. No one paid him much mind while he was alive, and so no one paid him much mind when he died. But though the emperors of the West had been rendered so ineffectual that it literally didn't matter whether they lived or died, no one thought that a successor wouldn't soon be appointed. The new appointee would be another puppet, of course, but the show must go on, you know? But while the Mediterranean world wondered who would be the next emperor, a funny thing happened. No next emperor appeared. The virtual king of Italy, Ricimer, was done with all that rot. He was in charge of Italy. He had been in charge of Italy, so why should he have to share power with anyone? So from the summer of 465 until April of 467, he didn't share power with anyone. There just wasn't an emperor of the Western Empire. Over in Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor Leo was not thrilled about this development, but he was in no immediate position to do anything about it. Through all of 466, the Eastern Empire was dealing with fairly serious raids by the Huns and the Goths. Leo had his hands full, and so Ricimer got away with his de facto kingship. But as 466 gave way to 467, the Western Empire's problems started becoming the Eastern Empire's problems, and so Leo felt obliged to finally do something about the vacant imperial throne in Italy. And which problem was it that specifically was becoming the Eastern Empire's problem? The Vandals, of course. Genseric was still hankering to get Libius in power, and with Ricimer refusing to listen, the Vandal king decided to turn up the heat on Constantinople. So Genseric extended Vandal piracy into eastern waters and started raiding Greece. His strategy, I think, was to trade stopping the piracy in Greece for the elevation of Libius. But if this was the point, then it backfired spectacularly, because mostly these new raids just made Leo really, really mad and convinced him that it was finally time to do something about the illegal Vandal kingdom that had been squatting in Roman North Africa for the last 30 years. But before he could do something about the squatters in North Africa, Leo wanted to make sure that the resources of the West would be properly mustered to help out the cause. And with King Ricimer not exactly the most dependable bloke on the block, Leo decided that it was high time he filled the almost 2-year-old imperial vacancy. But who to elevate, who to elevate? He wasn't going to give Genseric the satisfaction of elevating Libius, because Libius might wind up being even less dependable than Ricimer. Because at some point in here, Genseric had made the grand gesture of releasing the old Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughter Placidia, and putting them on a boat to Constantinople. Reunited with his wife, or should I say probably united for the first time with his wife, Libius might be thinking that Genseric wasn't such a bad guy after all, and maybe worth allying with if he ever got the chance to be Western Emperor. So for Leo, Libius was ruled out. So who did that leave? Interestingly, it left the man who very nearly became Emperor of the East just before Leo wound up getting the job back in 457, Procopius Anthemius. Anthemius, as you'll recall, was the grandson of the old Praetorian prefect Anthemius, and he was married to the late Emperor Marcian's daughter. Near the end of Marcian's life, the emperor had heaped honor upon his son-in-law, and it looked a lot like Marcian himself expected Anthemius to succeed him. But then Leo was crowned instead. This meant that for the last few years, Anthemius had just been kind of lurking around Constantinople, offering a totally plausible alternative should a bunch of conspirators get together and decide to do away with Leo. So Leo decided to kill two birds with one stone. By appointing Anthemius Emperor of the West, he was not only getting a rock-solid military commander, eminently capable of doing his part in the coming war with the Vandals, but he was also getting rid of a dangerous rival. So in the spring of 467, Anthemius headed off to Italy to assume his new position. But what about Ricimer, you ask? Was he just going to accept Anthemius' elevation? Well, maybe he would and maybe he wouldn't. But Anthemius didn't just throw on a backpack and wander into Italy like some random tourist. As he approached the Alps, he swung through Dalmatia and picked up Marcellinus and Marcellinus' army. Then he crossed over into Italy. Ricimer could either get with the program or fight to the death. But just remember that even if you beat me, Leo is probably going to take it personally and turn that armada he's building to fight the Vandals against you. So why don't you just get with the program? But that said, it's not like Anthemius wasn't aware that he was a Greek-speaking outsider in Italy. Ricimer and the Italian nobility formed a pretty tight clique these days. So for Anthemius, leveraging his way into power was one thing. Staying in power and being able to do anything with that power, that was a whole different ball of wax. So straight away, he arranged a good old-fashioned political marriage between his only daughter and Ricimer. Look, now we're all one big happy family, right? Cool. Good. Because we're about to launch like a six-pronged assault of the Vandals, and it's important that we're all on the same page. At almost exactly the same time, Leo was having these same sorts of thoughts, and so he married his daughter to Anthemius' son. So now we're all one big happy family, right? Cool. Because seriously, this is going to be a very complicated operation, and we all need to be together on this thing. But there was one member of this big happy family who wasn't cool. Leo's brother-in-law, Basiliscus. And unfortunately for everyone, Basiliscus was about to be named the point man for this very complicated operation. Depending on who you believe, Basiliscus was either too dumb or too clever by half to be leading the invasion. But under pressure from his wife, Leo agreed to put her brother in charge of the war. And it's not like this war was going to be some little PR stunt. The East had sent armies west to keep a lid on the Vandals at least twice before, but both of those were more shows of force or negotiating tactics than anything else. But Leo was going big. This was not about negotiation. This was about conquest. Our forever exaggerated sources are probably just a little exaggerated, but still, just to give you an idea of the scope of this thing, they say that Leo spent tens of thousands of pounds of gold building a fleet, that he spent hundreds of thousands of pounds of silver. They say that 1,100 ships bearing 100,000 men set sail from Constantinople in the spring of 468. Like I say, this was not about negotiation. This was about conquest. While this fleet sailed, the Western forces prepared to do their part. The General Marcellinus and his army were tasked with the mission of dislodging the Vandals from their bases in Sardinia and Sicily, and then providing logistical support to the main Eastern invasion army. There is also some scanty evidence that Anthemius tried to either send Roman forces up around through Spain, or that he tried to induce local forces there to join in the campaign, opening up what would have been a fourth front of the war. But it doesn't appear to have come to anything. At first, the invasion went as well as the Romans might expect, given their firepower. The massive Eastern fleet was met by a force of Vandal ships, but the Vandals were completely overmatched, and it is reported that hundreds of their ships were sunk. Following this initial victory, the two main fronts of the war were officially opened. A land army was deposited near Tripoli under the direction of a general named Heraclius. This army would approach the Vandal capital of Carthage, while Basiliscus led the rest of the fleet around to blockade the city. Heraclius had no trouble with the locals, and as he approached Carthage, he captured every city he passed. Meanwhile, up north, Marcellinus had opened up the third front of the war off the Italian coast, and after driving the Vandals off Sardinia with relative ease, he turned and began the slightly more difficult task of winning back control of Sicily. At this point, all was going well. All was going according to plan, and it looked like North Africa would be retaken in a matter of months, if not weeks. But then things started to unravel. I'm not sure exactly when this happened, but it had to have been shortly after winning back Sicily. But Marcellinus was on the island preparing ships to continue on to North Africa, either as logistical support for the land army, or to simply sail down with an army of his own and join the fight. Whatever he was up to, he never got off the island. He was betrayed by some of his officers and murdered, almost certainly at the instigation of Ricimer, who feared that his rival was gaining too much power. Ricimer then refused to let any of the western ships leave for North Africa. No supply runs, no reinforcements. Okay, well, that's not ideal, but the Eastern Army is like 100,000 strong, right? More than enough to finish the job on their own. As I just mentioned, there are two possible explanations for why this invasion is about to turn into such a disaster. The first is that Basiliscus was incompetent. Just straight up didn't have what it took to walk a ball over to a can and drop it in, which was just about all that was left for him to do. The other explanation was that he was a sneaky snake, and he botched the thing on purpose. In this telling, Basiliscus had imperial ambitions of his own, and he was in league with the Eastern general Aspar to undermine Leo by wrecking the emperor's signature initiative. As Ricimer had discovered, finding a good puppet was not as easy as you might think. And following Marcian's death, Aspar had pushed for Leo over Anthemius because he thought Leo would be easy to control. But Leo had not been so easy to control. And indeed, Aspar suspected that the emperor was in the middle of a little side project to completely shut Aspar and Aspar's Germanic allies out of power. So, the thinking goes, Aspar had gotten together with Basiliscus, and the two had hatched a plan to intentionally screw up the invasion to humiliate Leo. This had been a massively expensive campaign. If it ended badly, people would start asking why the emperor had nearly bankrupted the East on some boondoggle in the West. Maybe those questions would get hostile enough that Leo could be overthrown, and Basiliscus installed in his place. This was a clever plan, but as we will see, probably too clever by half, because, Basiliscus is about to come off looking like quite a fool. And really, who wants a fool or an emperor? With the noose quickly tightening around his neck, Genseric scrambled to figure a way out of what appeared to be his certain doom. Romans were coming by land, Romans were coming by sea. In a few days, Carthage would be blockaded, and that would probably be all she wrote for the Vandal kingdom of North Africa. But Genseric was a survivor. So, as Basiliscus approached, Genseric sent out envoys to meet with the Romans and work something out. These envoys came bearing, let's call them gifts, and they begged Basiliscus to give Genseric a few days to work out the logistics of his surrender. Basiliscus accepted these gifts and decided that giving the Vandals some breathing space at this critical juncture seemed like a fine idea. But Genseric isn't planning to surrender, you dummy. He's preparing to fight it out to the death. He just wants to make sure the final battle is fought on his terms, because he's, smart. As the Roman fleet sat at anchor twiddling its thumbs and refusing to bring the hammer down on Carthage, Genseric laid his plans carefully. Some of his ships he loaded with every man he could find who could carry a sword. Soldier, civilian, didn't really matter. Here's a spear, you get on this ship. Here's an axe, you get on that ship. But a few of these ships he left empty. These he loaded with flammable material, and yes, I can see where this is going. Then Genseric waited until the winds were right. and on the 5th day after buying off Basiliscus, the winds were right. The Vandal fleet set sail. Maybe Basiliscus thought they were just abandoning the city, or maybe he realized that he had been duped. Who knows? But as the Vandals approached, some of the ships started coming ahead of the rest, and oh my goodness, those ships are on fire. We should probably do something, and oh, it's too late, isn't it? The fire ships smashed into the totally surprised and tightly bunched Roman fleet, and the fires quickly spread. As soon as the fiery chaos had the Romans thoroughly distracted, the rest of the Vandal fleet descended. Though I'm sure Genseric lost a few ships of his own to the fires, it was nothing compared to the Romans, who lost something like 600 ships, just about half their fleet. And who knows how many men went down with those ships. With the invasion in utter bloody, fiery chaos, Basiliscus, who did not go down with any of his ships, decided to throw in the towel and withdraw. If his plan all along had been to botch the invasion to make Leo look bad, then Basiliscus A. totally succeeded, but B. was about to discover something he had obviously overlooked. A debacle of this magnitude might reflect badly on an emperor, but it's also going to reflect really badly on the guy who actually led the debacle. Disgraced, Basiliscus basically had to go into hiding upon his return to Constantinople. Which is why the whole make Leo look bad explanation, while juicy, is not really a complete meal. Basiliscus had to have known that it would be bad for him too, right? I mean, obviously it wasn't supposed to go down as horribly as it did, but still, what could he have been thinking? Either way, Basiliscus is a dingbat. Seriously, go look this guy up. He is a jackass. The failed attempt to retake North Africa nearly bankrupted the treasuries of both East and West and produced no tangible benefits. It would be 65 years before Constantinople made another stab at retaking North Africa. After the failures of 468, however, Anthemius refused to simply give up the ghost and accept that being Emperor of the West basically meant being the kind of ruler of the Italian peninsula. So, like Majorian, Anthemius attempted to keep pressing back against the tide of history, and in 469 he instigated a campaign to retake Gaul. During the uncertain years of the interregnum, when Ricimer ruled alone, the Goths up in Aquitaine became filled with a new expansionist spirit. In 466, Theodoric II had been killed by his far more ambitious younger brother Euric, and under Euric's leadership, the Goths began to spread deeper into both Spain and Gaul, slowly annexing more and more territory. With his treasury drained, Anthemius was unable to halt this spread himself, but he did induce Reothimus, the king of the Bretons, to fight on Rome's behalf. Possibly coming down from the island of Britain, but more likely coming in from the Brittany Peninsula, Reothimus did indeed march on Rome's behalf, but he was beaten and driven back by the newly empowered Goths. This brief little war is hardly worth mentioning in itself, but it is interesting in that Reothimus is one of the possible candidates for the title of historical King Arthur. The next year saw no time for any kind of positive steps forward for the West, because the brief honeymoon period between Ricimer and Anthemius was about to come to an abrupt end, as we all knew that it would. At some point in 470, a plot to assassinate Anthemius was uncovered in the upper reaches of the imperial court. This plot centered around the Master of Offices, a man named Romanus, and after the plot was discovered, Anthemius understandably responded by executing Romanus for his treachery. The only hitch was that Romanus was a Ricimer man through and through, and the virtual king of Italy did not appreciate it when one of his close associates was killed by some foreign aristocrat who thought himself emperor. Immediately after the execution, Ricimer gathered up 6,000 men and marched them into Milan, shutting the gates behind them. Anthemius was down in Rome when Ricimer decided to occupy Milan, and it was very clear to everyone that some kind of civil war was about to break out. But just as things were about to get out of hand, both sides decided to pull back. The Bishop of Pavia, a man named Epiphanius, acted as a go-between, and the two rival leaders agreed to a one-year truce. Epiphanius, incidentally, was just getting started on a long and distinguished diplomatic career, and was eventually made Saint Epiphanius. And incidentally, a biography written in the early 500s detailing the bishop's adventures through the crazy post-Roman Western world forms a key primary source for a lot of what we're talking about here today. Anyway, with a civil war averted, Anthemius took his one-year truce with Ricimer and used it to once again attempt to reassert some control in Gaul and push back the encroaching Goths. An army led by Anthemius' own son crossed the Alps in 471, but history had turned decisively against the imperial authorities in Italy. The Romans were beaten back, and the Goths wound up stronger than ever, controlling virtually all of southern Gaul and severing the last link between Rome and the domain of the Soissons, the last remnant of Roman authority left in the north. With Anthemius failing to make headway in Gaul, his popularity in Italy faltered badly. His standing with the Italians had never been that great, since they all saw him as some foreigner butting his head into their affairs. But they were willing to go along with him, since he had the backing of the East, and who knows, maybe he can pull a rabbit out of his hat. But when he failed to pull out the rabbit, they turned on him. When the one-year truce with Ricimer expired, the virtual king was crouched and ready to pounce. Anthemius' position was so weak that he didn't even bother trying to meet strength with strength. Instead, he feigned an illness and asked for asylum within St. Peter's. This move bought him time to send word to Leo that the natives had gotten restless and that maybe some muscle from the east was in order. But Leo was still reeling from the disastrous misadventure in North Africa, and plus, he really didn't have any muscle to send. So instead, he sent one man, who had some standing in the west, to broker another truce, Libius. Now, sending Libius was perhaps a curious choice. Sure, the nobility of the West was bound to at least hear him out. He was, after all, one of them. But at the same time, this is a guy who has a reasonably valid claim to the throne himself. Certainly, Genseric would back him at the first chance he got. So how did Leo not think that Libius wouldn't just show up, cut a deal with Ricimer, oust Anthemius, and then make common cause with the Vandals? Well, for starters, Libius had to leave his wife and daughter behind in Constantinople, which is enough to keep most men honest. But beyond that, there is one other small point of importance. Leo did not really want Libius to broker a truce between Ricimer and Anthemius. What Leo really wanted was for Anthemius' rule to be made perfectly secure. Ricimer threatened that security. Libius, with his own claims to power, also threatened that security. So right before the diplomatic mission sailed, Leo went to one of the sub-secretaries and entrusted him with the real plan. The sub-secretary was given a note for Anthemius' eyes only. I want you to kill Ricimer and Libius as soon as you get this. Next week, though, we will see how maybe Leo should not have put this in writing. Ricimer had men stationed all over Italy, and when the diplomatic mission from Constantinople arrived at the port of Ostia, Ricimer had men there too. Men with orders to search everyone and everything aboard to determine whether this thing was on the level. When Ricimer discovered Leo's note, that's going to be the end of Anthemius, even though technically he had nothing to do with anything. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 178, Not with a Bang, but a Whimper. Last time, we left off with Anthemius holed up in Rome, and Ricimer making all kinds of noises about ousting the Eastern appointed emperor and replacing him with someone more pliable. When Libius and his little diplomatic mission showed up from Constantinople in the spring of 472, those noises turned into direct action. Hidden among the papers of one of the secretaries was a message from Leo to Anthemius directing his Western colleague to kill Ricimer and Libius in order to eliminate these two most obvious threats to Anthemius' rule. When Ricimer's men discovered the message, they showed it to their boss, who showed it to Libius. Both were outraged and agreed that they should join forces and kill Anthemius before he could kill them. Their agreement was sealed right then and there when Ricimer ordered his men to hail Libius as the new Augustus of the West. Now, this is never mentioned in the sources, but I can't help but wonder about the credibility of Ricimer in all this. I mean, think about it. Ricimer's men just so happen to find a written note from Leo that leaves Libius with no choice but to side with the virtual king of Italy instead of carrying out his original mission of brokering a peace. I mean, it might very well be true that Leo sent along handwritten, murderous orders, but it's not like it's implausible that Ricimer just made the whole thing up, you know? Word quickly reached Rome that a coup had begun down the road, and Anthemius rushed out of hiding to direct the gates of the city be shut and the defenses manned. He then sent messengers up the imperial post roads to Gaul to summon all the available forces there left under imperial command. But by the time the messengers arrived, whatever forces were left in Gaul had already begun to fracture. The available soldiers split between the Magister Militum, a general named Bilimer, and a Burgundian chief named Gundobad, who just so happened to be Ricimer's nephew. Gundobad had at one point served as Magister Militum for Gaul, but at some point he had been replaced by Bilimer, either following the near civil war of the previous year, or right at this very moment. By which I mean that, knowing he couldn't trust Gundobad, Anthemius sent his plea for help to Bilimer, officially making him Magister Militum in the same breath. Whichever way it went down, when the coup erupted, two forces wound up marching down from Gaul to help, one led by Bilimer to reinforce Anthemius, and the other led by Gundobad to reinforce Ricimer and Libius. It is hard to see this ever really working out for Anthemius. He was, after all, a stranger in a strange land, and most of the local nobility was solidly in Ricimer's camp. But the emperor did somehow manage to keep Rome shut tight, at least into the early summer. It seems pretty clear, though, that he was pinning all his hopes on reinforcements from Gaul, and morale within Rome was almost entirely based on the assumption that relief was on its way. When that relief showed up in July, though, the air really went out of Anthemius' sails. Bilimer arrived with his troops from Gaul all right, but he was promptly defeated in battle by Ricimer's forces. This brief battle is interesting to us for two reasons. First, it pretty much ended any hope Anthemius had of escaping this thing with his life, and second, it marks the first appearance in the historical record of Odoacer, who was a commander of some high-level bodyguards who had gone over to Ricimer back in the spring. With Bilimer defeated, the entire citizen body of Rome essentially deserted Anthemius, as there was absolutely no reason for any one of them to suffer or die on his behalf. He was simply not a ship worth going down with. So as the gates of Rome were opened and Ricimer's men came pouring in, once again Anthemius took refuge within a church. There is some disagreement as to whether he went back to St. Peter's or whether he holed up in Santa Maria of Trastevere, but it doesn't make much difference because it didn't do him any good. He was tracked down by a search party led by Gundobad, and when the fallen emperor was found, Gundobad paid very little attention to the sanctity of the church. Anthemius was immediately beheaded. He was about 50 years old and had been emperor for just over 5 years. There are now 4 emperors left. Anthemius was the last who had any sort of talent or ability. With Anthemius dead and Olybrius now elevated in his place, the Italian nobility, who were already mostly with Ricimer, were now doubly happy because Olybrius, one of their own, was back in power. But the man who had to have been happiest of all was the Vandal king Genseric. He had been fighting and arguing and pleading and cajoling to get Olybrius on the throne for years, going all the way back to the fall of Avitus and Ricimer's initial rise to power back in 458. Now he finally had what he wanted. The brother-in-law of his daughter-in-law now sat on the throne of the West. These were happy days for the Vandal king. Just a few years after it looked like he was going to be toppled from power by a massive invasion fleet, not only was he still standing, but he had finally gotten his way. Happy, happy days. But fate, oh fate, she has a wicked sense of humor. First she giveth, and then she taketh away. But at first she appeared to be truly in the giving sort of mood, at least from Genseric's point of view. Because in August of 472, just a month after Anthemius' fall, Ricimer, the virtual king of Italy, keeled over dead. The historical diagnosis is massive hemorrhage. He was about 67 years old and had been the virtual king of Italy for 15 years, bridging the gap between Stilicho and Odoacer. So from Genseric's point of view, this all could not be working out better. The only thing that would have stopped him from exerting a huge amount of influence over Olybrius was Ricimer, and now Ricimer was dead. The only thing that could possibly screw this up is if Olybrius were to, suddenly keel over dead himself. And what are the odds of that happening? What's that you say? Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. In late October or early November 472, Olybrius died of dropsy. Though no one seems to want to give me a solid birth date, he was maybe in his mid-40s when he died, and had been emperor for 6 months or 3 months, depending on whether you date his reign from his elevation by Ricimer or from the fall of Anthemius. Just like that, there are only 3 emperors left. Well, 2 if you happen to be a partisan of Julius Nepos, but mainstream history does not appear to be a partisan of Julius Nepos. When Ricimer died, he was immediately succeeded by his nephew Gundobad, who, after killing Anthemius in a church, had proven himself to be a man you did not want to mess around with. So when Olybrius died a few months later, the power that had normally been reverting to Ricimer instead reverted to Gundobad. The new virtual king of Italy pondered what he was going to do about the vacant throne over the winter of 472-473, and then in March decided to elevate the unknown, well, unknown to us anyway, captain of the elite court bodyguard, Glycerius, about whom we know next to nothing before he becomes emperor in March of 473. Glycerius' elevation, like I should note the elevation of Olybrius the year before, was never recognized in the East. For Leo, Anthemius had been the legitimate emperor of the West, and everything that had happened since his death amounted to illegal usurpation. Had Olybrius lived, Leo would have certainly tried to toss him out and replace him with another Eastern candidate. But Olybrius died before Leo could even begin to plan a counter-revolution, so it was left to Glycerius to deal with the wrath of Constantinople. Well, not exactly the wrath of Constantinople. Though the East had recovered somewhat from its debacle in North Africa, I doubt Leo had any interest in sending another army off to the West. For example, it probably would have been political suicide. So instead, he got in touch with the aforementioned Julius Nepos, and talked him into mounting an expedition to oust the usurpers in Italy. Nepos was the nephew of the general Marcellinus, and he had inherited his uncle's quasi-independent territory of Dalmatia, and as such had access to a good number of Hun and Goth mercenaries. Leo essentially told Nepos that Constantinople was prepared to recognize him as emperor of the West should he decide to go seize the throne from Glycerius. This sounded like a pretty good deal to Nepos, so he started to prepare for an invasion. But Julius Nepos' invasion was not the only invasion Glycerius and Gundobad had to contend with. Up in Gaul, the Goth king Euric was getting even more ambitious, and it appears that he had designs on perhaps sweeping down and seizing northern Italy for himself. At the same time, another Goth king named Vitimer, who ran a little autonomous kingdom between the Danube and Dalmatia, also appears to have been considering making a run at Italy. Which brings me to a point that I probably should have made a long time ago, but I didn't for decent reasons that eventually became a little ridiculous. Back during the initial run-up to the Battle of Adrianople, we distinguished between the Tervingi and Greuthungi branches of the Goth nation. But ever since then, it's just sort of been Goth this and Goth that. This was mostly because, for the last century, we've been dealing exclusively with Alaric's Goths, the Tervingi, whose descendants are now firmly established in Gaul, so there was no need to make any distinction. But what about that most famous of Goth distinctions? If you listen to the history of Rome, you would never know that there was something called a Visigoth and something called an Ostrogoth. So, what is an Ostrogoth and what is a Visigoth? Well, at first, I avoided the terminology because it was not invented until way later, and is often anachronistically misapplied to the groups that we've been dealing with, and I didn't want to get caught in the trap. But by this point, the late 400s, even if the labels weren't contemporaneously used, everyone agrees that we call these guys Visigoths and those guys Ostrogoths. So who were they? Well, essentially, all Visigoth means is Western Goth, and all Ostrogoth means is Eastern Goth. So Alaric's Goths, who had moved into Italy and then up into Gaul, became known as the Visigoths. The Goths who stayed behind, straddling the Danube and contending with the Huns, became known as the Ostrogoths. So, for example, history books often speak of the Visigoth sack of Rome in 410, and the Ostrogoth kingdom that was established in Italy following the fall of the Western Empire. In terms of reality, these signifiers mean very little. But in terms of understanding history and keeping things straight in your head, Visigoth and Ostrogoth is actually a fairly important distinction. So, now you know. What that means is that up in Gaul, the Visigoth king Euric was likely planning an invasion of Italy, and over south of the Danube, his counterpart, the Ostrogoth king Vitimer, was contemplating the same thing. The great fear down in Ravenna, where Glycerius had taken up residence, was that the two great branches of the Goth nation would join forces and crush what was left of the empire. Possibly to Glycerius' great credit, though, or maybe it was just luck, not only did the two Goth branches not link up, but neither wound up invading Italy. This may have been the work of Gundobad, though, who right around this same time returned to Gaul to attend to some family business. It is not unreasonable to assume that the ethnic Burgundian used his contacts within the neighboring Visigoth community to secure a peace. But neither Gundobad nor Glycerius was able to do anything about Julius Nepos, who was not going to be deterred by anything unless his patron Leo died and threw Constantinople's backing of the adventure into doubt. But that's not going to happen. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. In January of 474, Leo the Thracian died. He was 74 years old and had been emperor of the East for 17 years. When he died, he was officially succeeded by his grandson Leo II. But since the new emperor was maybe only 6 years old, power really wound up in the hands of Leo I's son-in-law and Leo II's father, the Isaurian general Zeno. Zeno had risen to prominence as part of Emperor Leo's push to get out from under the domination of Aspar and the Germanic commanders who had dominated the court of Constantinople. Leo had used the debacle in North Africa, among other things, as an excuse to turn on the man who had made him emperor all those years ago, and in 471, Aspar and his son Ardabur were executed. Zeno, meanwhile, was a leading member of Leo's new favorite clique of military officers, and he was married to the emperor's daughter in 466. When Aspar fell, Zeno stepped into his place. When Leo died, Zeno became co-emperor along with his son Leo II. When Leo II died that November, Zeno claimed imperial power for himself. The official report says that Leo II died of natural causes, but conspiracy theories abound about who really killed the boy, and I, of course, tend to believe that Livia did it. Fortunately for Julius Nepos, Zeno seemed amenable to the idea of ousting Glycerius and backing Nepos' claim to the throne. After all, as Leo's chief military advisor, Zeno had almost certainly come up with the idea himself. So in June of 474, Julius Nepos and his army sailed from Dalmatia, down around the Italian peninsula, and landed at the mouth of the Tiber, probably on the right bank, at the imperial port of Portus. Glycerius appears to have been alerted to the fact that Nepos was sailing around Italy, and he rushed down to Rome to meet him. Whether he intended to offer up any resistance is an open question, but when Julius Nepos docked, it was immediately obvious that his forces were much stronger than anything Glycerius had at his disposal. As I said, Gundobad was still up in Gaul while all this was happening, leaving Glycerius to deal with the invasion by himself. It is also possible that he rushed down to Rome to take the pulse of the Senate and see where they stood. Were they disposed to back him, or would they abandon him for the newcomer? With the answer appearing to be back the newcomer, Glycerius gave it up. When Nepos arrived, Glycerius was there to meet him, and he surrendered without so much as a sword being drawn. Glycerius was in his mid-50s, and had been emperor for just over a year. Nepos, for his part, took this bloodless victory well, and instead of killing Glycerius, he followed the lead of Ricimer and Majorian, and made Glycerius a bishop, specifically the bishop of Salona, the major port city in Nepos' home province of Dalmatia, which is more famous to students of Roman history as the city where Diocletian retired to following his abdication in 305. With Glycerius out of the picture, there are now just two emperors left, unless you believe Julius Nepos, and lots of good people think that we really ought to believe Julius Nepos. After being accepted as emperor by the Senate, Nepos set to work laying the foundation for his long and glorious rule. His first order of business was officially firing Gundobad and elevating a Gallic native named Ecdicius to the rank of Magister Militum. Ecdicius's main claim to fame was that he was the son of Avitus, and if Julius was going to ever have any hope of recovering Gaul, he was going to need the support of the Gallic Romano nobility. Since most of them still carried a torch for Avitus, Avitus's son was brought into the administration. With Ecdicius almost certainly doing the negotiating, Julius Nepos got his reign off to a fine start by working out a land swap peace deal with Euric and the Visigoths. In exchange for the Gothic withdrawal from Provence, the Romans would grant them title to lands further north and west that they had no hope of reclaiming right now anyway. There is some disagreement in the historical record about how and why this plan was approved, with some blaming Ecdicius for blundering away territory, but the general consensus seems to be that this was Nepos' conscious plan from the start, to maintain a geographically contiguous territory and worry about unreachable pockets of Roman territory, like the domain of Soissons, later. The chroniclers, like Jordanus, who tend to blame Ecdicius's blundering, use that alleged blundering to explain the rise of Orestes. because in early 475, Orestes was suddenly and inexplicably made Magister Militum at Ecdicius's expense. Orestes was a soldier and politician of Germanic descent who had once upon a time been attached to Attila the Hun's court, serving as a secretary and diplomat for the Hun king. When the Huns sent envoys to Constantinople to demand more indemnity payments, you can be sure that Orestes was on at least a few of those missions. After Hun unity was shattered after the death of Attila in the 450s, Orestes appears to have drifted into the Western orbit, and by the 470s, somehow, he had become a prominent member of the Western establishment. He was also the father of a young boy named Romulus. The exact reasons for his elevation are obscure. Either it was indeed because Ecdicius had freelanced the deal with the Goths over Nepos' head, and so he got the big ugly axe. But another explanation is that the elevation of Orestes was engineered by the Senate, who, though they technically acquiesced to Nepos' rule when he had a very strong army in their backyard, were now trying to undermine him. In this telling, Ecdicius was not recalled to Italy because he was being fired. He was recalled to Italy to help Nepos fend off a possible attack by the suddenly emboldened Orestes. Whichever it was, in mid-475, Orestes organized a revolt against Nepos in Rome. Whether the emperor was in Ravenna at the time, or whether he just fled there when he found out what Orestes was up to, is unknown. But it seems pretty clear that Orestes marched north at the head of some kind of army, and Nepos, fearing for his life, boarded a ship and fled to Dalmatia. Though he would never relinquish his claim to power, he would remain in Dalmatia as a quasi-private citizen until he was finally killed in 480. During the 5 years he spent in Salona in exile, his personal bishop was none other than the deposed Glycerius, which I believe marks only the second time that two former emperors were able to get together and just kind of shoot the breeze. The first being the brief imperial summit attended by both Diocletian and Maximian in 308, after the Tetrarchy started to break down. When Orestes arrived in Ravenna and found that Julius Nepos had flown the coop, he decided to take the logical step and seize power. But probably due to his Germanic extraction and old connections to Attila the Hun, Orestes didn't presume to claim the throne for himself. Although, that said, no one really knows why Orestes did not proclaim himself emperor, or why his son would have been more acceptable. For example, Gibbon simply states that it was, quote, for some secret motive, unquote. Whatever those secret motives were, on October the 31st, 475, 14 or 15-year-old Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus, was proclaimed emperor in Ravenna. So now you can see why Julius Nepos keeps raising a stink about how he's really the last emperor of the Western Empire. He had the backing of Constantinople. After marrying one of Leo's nieces, he had ties to the Eastern imperial family. He had been driven off by an illegal coup led by some barbarian secretary of Attila the Hun. His successor was a 14-year-old puppet. So why does he get to be the last emperor of the West and not me? I'll still be claiming imperial authority until they kill me in 480. Shouldn't the fall of the West at least be linked to my death, not the exile of some anonymous kid? Well, unfortunately, that's not the way history remembers it, my friend. But your objections are duly noted for the record. Julius Nepos was in his mid-40s, and he had been emperor for just about a year, though he would maintain his claim to the throne for another 4 years until he was murdered in 480. Orestes settled into Ravenna to lay the groundwork for his own long and glorious rule, but unlike Nepos, who actually got off to a fairly decent start, Orestes started screwing things up right off the bat. Shortly after seizing power, the new puppet master of Italy was approached by a group of federated soldiers who demanded what soldiers had been demanding from time immemorial: better pay and more land. Orestes, feeling awfully secure in his position for absolutely no good reason, refused to grant any sort of concessions. So the soldiers went to their captain, who just so happened to be Odoacer, and asked him to please do something about this joker calling the shots in Ravenna. Odoacer agreed to do something about him, all right. In August of 476, Odoacer told him that if they wanted, he would lead them in revolt against Orestes, that he would rid them of their problem, and if all went well, rid them of haughty imperial bureaucrats forever. 5 days later, Odoacer marched on Ravenna and caught Orestes near Piacenza. The little snake was trying to sneak away. He was executed immediately. A few days later, Odoacer entered Ravenna, killed Orestes' brother, occupied the imperial palace, and tracked down young Romulus Augustulus. Taking pity on the boy, who was, after all, just a puppet of his father, Odoacer decided to let the boy live, and he exiled him down to an estate in Campania. Romulus Augustulus was maybe 15 or 16 years old, and he was emperor for 10 months. So, no, the Western Empire did not exactly go out with a bang. After deposing the boy emperor, Odoacer collected up the imperial regalia, put it in a package bound for Constantinople with a note for the Emperor Zeno. There is no longer any need for separate empires. A single emperor is enough. I will rule Italy in your name, but don't bother sending any imperial replacements. With that, the line of Western emperors was truly broken. Yes, Julius Nepos, I hear you wailing over there, but did you ever make it back to Italy? Were you ever able to wrest back control of your empire from Odoacer? No? Well, okay then. You and Glycarius go back to playing backgammon, or whatever it is that you do. So, that's it, right? I mean, here we are. Today is someday. It is 476 AD, and Romulus Augustulus, last emperor of the Western Empire, has just been exiled. The History of Rome podcast, as once upon a time defined by me, is over. But it wouldn't be very nice of me to just go off and leave you like that. So we will be back next week for one final episode. All good stories have an epilogue, so the History of Rome shall too have an epilogue. A chance to wrap things up, ponder all the stuff that comes after 476 that we didn't get to, wonder aloud why the West fell but the East kept right on trucking, and gaze in awe at the legacy of the Roman Empire. Are we going to stumble upon a grand unified theory of Roman history? I doubt it, but it will be good to digest what we've all been through and what will come next. So I will see you next week for the final episode of the History of Rome. Unless, of course, we have a baby in the next 7 days, in which case, see ya. Hello, and welcome to the final episode of the History of Rome, episode 179, The End. About 5 years ago, I got it into my head to start a podcast. After hearing 12 Byzantine rulers and loving it, I tried to find a podcast on Roman history, because surely there must be one, but I came up empty. I was in the middle of reading The War with Hannibal by Livy, and thought that, man, there is a lot of really cool stories buried in here that never see the light of day because, my God, this reading is so dry. So I started to think that maybe I should start a podcast about Roman history. I went and snagged my copy of The Early History of Rome by Livy and used it to outline the first dozen or so episodes, the 7 Kings, the 12 Tables, the Sack of Rome. Then I Googled how to podcast. Then I fought bitterly with technology for about a week. Then I got it all straightened out. And on July 27th, 2007, I published the first episode of the cleverly titled History of Rome. Then I settled into a nice routine of publishing every Sunday night. We went through the early quasi-mythical period of half-remembered legend because Brennus and the Gauls burned Rome to the ground in 390 BC. We went from the kings through the establishment of the Republic, the conflict of the orders, Roman expansion out into Italy, wars with the Etruscans and Latins and the Samnites, and history started to become less mythical and more concrete. Finally, we got into the bits that I really wanted to get into from the beginning, the Punic Wars, Hannibal and Scipio, the great struggle that left Rome the strongest power in the Mediterranean world. Then we started running into problems with hosting, because amazingly, too many people were listening to the show, and it was crashing archive.org. Then we ran into problems with episode limits on the blogging service I was using, but we kept going and made it into the 100s BC and the conquest of Greece, the civil unrest let loose by the Gracchi brothers, the rise of Marius, and the rise of Sulla. Then, for those of you who have been around that long, you'll remember that the show went on hiatus for 7 months because I completely burned out. For those of you who discovered the show later, just know that the whole thing almost died at episode 33, Marius and Sulla. But it only almost died. I bought a new laptop and decided that I would hate myself forever if I didn't finish the job. I had planned to do about 75 episodes, and I was all ready to the breakdown of the Republic, so I didn't want to be the guy who swam 2/3 of the English Channel, got tired, and swam back. So then we went through the civil wars of Marius and Sulla, the rise of Crassus and Pompey, and then finally to the rise of Julius Caesar. It was at about episode 40 that I realized I was in big trouble. An entire episode was dedicated to a single year. But there was too much information, too much that we needed to understand, so progress ground to a complete halt. The fall of the Republic set the pace for the whole rest of the series. It took about 50 episodes to cover the 700 years from 753 to 60 BC, and it would take 140 more episodes to cover the remaining 500 years. But I didn't care. I was blissing out and loving every minute that I got to spend toiling away on my never-ending project. When the Julio-Claudian dynasty fell, I got married, and we moved from Portland, Oregon to Austin, Texas. With the new headquarters established, we plowed through the Flavians and the Antonines and started running into bad trouble like the Marcomanni Wars and Commodus. Then the Severans came along. Everything became a lot more militant and a lot more sinister. And then in the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire really should have ended. And in many ways it did. That crisis period has since become one of my favorite periods in Roman history, mostly because no one ever talks about it. No one ever goes into detail about it. It's always, well, the Severan dynasty fell apart, and things were really super crazy for 50 years. Okay, on to Diocletian and Constantine. But the crisis of the 3rd century is fascinating. It is utterly fascinating. It took us 16 episodes to get through that 50-year period alone. I think it was totally worth it. When we emerged from the crisis years, it was on to Diocletian and the Tetrarchy, and then the rise of Constantine and Christianity. Constantinople was founded while I was in Italy, enjoying the first of 3 Roman history tours, which was just an awesome, awesome time. historyofrometour.com. Yes, even though the show is ending, we want to keep doing them, but I will get to that. When I got back, we rolled into the breakdown of the Constantinian dynasty, Julian the Apostate, then on to Valentinian and Valens. Then we found out that Mrs. History of Rome was pregnant. Then it was on to the Battle of Adrianople and the rise of Theodosius. Things started to get really bad now. The barbarians were coming, but they were not going away. The empire split into east and west, but not really. The legions became almost entirely mercenary. Germanic generals were pulling the strings, but that wasn't a bad thing at all because the emperors were just terrible buffoons at this point. Stilicho gave way to Aetius just as I went back to school, because yes, I've been attending UT for the last 4 months and still putting out the show every week because I have no life. Then Gaul was overrun, and Spain was overrun, and North Africa was seized by the Vandals. Attila the Hun arrived just as I was heading off for the 4th History of Rome tour, which was another awesome time. Aetius gave way to Ricimer. The West began circling the drain. The final shadow emperors came and went. Romulus Augustulus was crowned, and then he was exiled. Our baby boy is due any day now. I am ready. Mrs. the History of Rome, I can promise you, is really ready. And so the history of Rome is over. 5 years of work, 675,000 words, 189 episodes, 74 hours of content. Good Lord, what a hell of a damn thing. Since we are at the end, it is worth taking a moment to wonder why this is the end. I mean, of the Roman Empire, not of the podcast. Now, as I already discussed, there are lots of arbitrary lines in the sand we can draw to say, before this Rome, after this, no more Rome. And I'm stopping at 476 out of a vague sense of historical convention. I don't really want to get into the debate about the superiority of this arbitrary line versus that arbitrary line, especially since one of the strongest arguments out there is that no one should talk about the fall of the Roman Empire until the Turks start blasting a hole in the side of the Theodosian walls in 1453, and that is just too far in the future for me to deal with. And besides, by that time, the descendants of Rome ruled a Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian-believing empire, which is, really, a wholly different cultural construction than the Latin-speaking pagans we began our journey with. So something clearly had changed. Something had broken down. Is the political, economic, and cultural makeup of Italy, for example, different in 800 AD than it was during the age of the Antonines? Clearly, yes. Was that makeup different in 600 than it was during the age of Constantine? I would say they were getting closer, but still, yes. What about 500 and 400? Well, much less so, but a few important things had changed. Strong emperors had been replaced by puppet emperors who had been replaced by no emperors. Tight borders had given way to porous borders, had given way to no borders. So something pretty important happened in the 5th and 6th centuries. And though it was a gradual transition, that does not mean we can't still talk about the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell at some point. That much, at least, I think we can all agree on. So the question is, why did Rome fall when it did? Or more precisely, why did the western half of the empire fall? Well, I have joked that there are 256 different reasons why the Western Empire fell, and though I am obviously exaggerating, it is not that much of an exaggeration. The decline and fall of something as monumentally complex as the Roman Empire is not going to be able to be explained away by one or two simple causes. Now, everyone has a pet theory, something they want to highlight over everything else, and Lord knows I've got my own suspicions. But the basic fact is that all of these theories are likely correct to some degree, and each played off each other in a synergistic orgy of destruction. In his nice little summation, The Fall of the Roman Empire, for example, Michael Grant offers 14 interacting tensions that led to the fall of the West. And just to give you a sense of the scope and flavor of what we're talking about, here they are. The generals against the state, the people against the army, the poor against the state, the rich against the state, the middle class against the state, the people against the bureaucrats, the people against the emperor, ally against ally, race against race, dropouts against society, the state against free belief, complacency against self-help, the other world against this world. Now, I tend to break all of this down into 6 broad categories, which I'd like to run through briefly with you now. Political factors, economic factors, military factors, social factors, religious factors, and environmental factors. Though we are not going to land on a definitive answer for why the Western Empire fell, it will still be fun to walk through each of these to give you an idea of what Rome was really up against in the late 400s. First, there are the political factors. By 476 AD, the governing apparatus of the Western Empire had become a brittle farce. The centralized regimentation introduced by Diocletian, which had perhaps given the empire a new lease on life during the 300s, was now killing it. The quality of the emperors, as you may have noticed, declined precipitously after the death of Theodosius. So the very center of this strict regimentation had become rotten. The emperors had all the theoretical power in the world, but that power was being wielded by cloistered fools, totally disconnected from the empire they allegedly ran. Plus, given that the communication networks of the day were falling apart along with everything else, even a great emperor couldn't hope to achieve what his propaganda and his edicts promised that he could. Local autonomy had thus become simultaneously dead and more important than ever, a contradictory circle that had become more difficult to square with each passing day. The bureaucracy was hopelessly corrupt. The best educated declined to enter state service because it was rightly viewed as a corrupt and dangerous occupation. The political apparatus, in other words, was broke and getting broker. Then there are the economic factors. We have already discussed at length the debilitating inflation that plagued the Western Empire in its final years. This inflation essentially destroyed the middle class and left the West divided between a few super wealthy landowners and the uncountable poor masses. Adding to the dilemma was a system of imperial taxation which ground those poor masses even deeper into the dirt. The super wealthy were able to defer tax payments until one of those moments of debt cancellation, or else they were able to use their influence to win tax exemptions. This left the poor classes, who had no such influence, to shoulder the burdens of state, burdens that far outweighed their ability to pay. So increasingly, they turned to the wealthy patrons for relief, essentially becoming indentured servants in exchange for the wealthy estate owner covering their tax bills, which laid the groundwork for the feudal system that would rule Europe for the next 1,000 years. This broken economic system also completely severed the bonds of patriotic loyalty that had once upon a time kept the political system functioning. The poor saw the state as a predator to be avoided at all cost. The rich saw it as a petty annoyance to be ignored at all cost. By the late 400s, the Western economy was disintegrating, and the central government was starved of funds. And then, of course, there are the military factors. The legions had been the backbone of the empire for a millennium, but by the 400s, the legions, as we had once known them, were essentially dead. Service in the army was seen by the free citizens as slavery by another name. Hard, dirty, and dangerous work that offered few rewards. The rich and poor alike conspired to hide potential conscripts from the state forces so that they could stay and work the large estates that were fast becoming the backbone of the new political and economic order. As a consequence, the imperial authorities turned increasingly to Germanic mercenaries who were all too happy to do the Romans fighting for them. But of course, after Adrianople, these forces ceased even fighting under Roman officers, and instead joined as whole national armies, fighting under their own kings. Though the emperors had little choice, and these barbarian forces fought hard for Rome, There is no getting around the fact that the objectives of Rome and the objectives of the barbarian mercenaries were never going to line up completely, because each viewed the other as an other. In effect, the empire was no longer able to raise a national army. It could only pay for protection. And this, I can assure you, is an unsustainable model of self-defense. Which brings us to the social factors, and my own personal hobby horse when it comes to explaining the decline of the Western Empire. The failure of the Western Empire to integrate their new Germanic inhabitants. One of the great geniuses of Rome had always been its ability to instantly incorporate new ideas and new peoples and new technologies into their empire without being weighed down by prejudice. It's what allowed them to own and operate one of the most ethnically diverse empires in history for hundreds and hundreds of years. When the Roman system began to fail in the 3rd century, for example, it was not senators on the Palatine Hill who led the rebirth of Rome. It was a group of Illyrian officers, mostly peasant-born Illyrian officers at that. Were it not for Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian, the emperor would have collapsed. Of that, I am quite sure. But as Rome reached a new crisis point, the ruling aristocracy suddenly became obsessed with racial prejudices. The most capable men of the age, Stilicho, Alaric, Aetius, Genseric, Theodoric, were all kept at arm's distance from access to real imperial power by an Italian aristocracy that suddenly began asserting the necessity of ethnic separation. The quote-unquote barbarians of the 5th century were flatly denied the respect of Rome. Their nations were settled in Roman territory as separate nations. Their leaders kept out of the imperial structure and forced to live either as antagonists like Genseric or Alaric, or as protagonists like Stilicho and Aetius, who were treated as second-class leaders. And if they weren't second-class leaders, then why aren't we talking about Emperor Stilicho and Emperor Aetius? Mostly, it's because the senators of the West refused to consider the possibility of a German-born emperor. In another parallel universe, the leadership of the West allows for the full social, moral, and political integration of the Germanic people into their empire in the 5th century, setting the stage for the rise of the German emperors, who, like the Illyrian emperors before them, revived the Roman name. These social forces were exacerbated by the religious factors. I will tread lightly on this subject and want to begin by saying that I do not accept Gibbon's argument that Christianity led to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But that said, the introduction of Christianity into the Roman bloodstream did lead to constant religious feuding that had been previously unknown to the Romans. Religious tolerance had always been one of the hallmarks of Roman rule and Roman unity. But by the 400s, there had been a transition to increasing religious intolerance. Christianity versus paganism, Nicaeans versus Arians, orthodoxy versus heresy. How many able administrators were caught up in the cycles of religious purges and counter-purges? How much time, energy, and resources were spent trying to bend the empire to one particular version of Christianity and then bend it back when another version rose to prominence? It would be impossible to calculate, but I can't help but think that everyone would have been better served if they have just left religion alone and focused their collective attention on the daily challenges of operating the empire instead. I am not prepared to say that religion was the main reason Rome fell, or even one of the most important reasons. But at a moment when the empire needed unity, religious intolerance acted as a disuniting force. Finally, there are the environmental factors. We are only just now beginning to pay attention to these sorts of conditional elements, but there is some evidence that between 250 and 550 AD, the climate of Europe began to fluctuate wildly. And this was not just a matter of gradual shifting, where the land that had once been good was now bad, but that from season to season there were crazy variations, undermining the kind of predictability an agricultural society requires to remain stable. We certainly see in later years far more sudden famines than we saw previously, and far less ability to absorb those famines when they came. You throw into this mix other underlying environmental factors like plague, and you get increasing depopulation, leading to abandoned land and more famine. I think as we move forward, we will begin to understand more and more the role that climate shifts have played in the rise and fall of civilizations over the course of world history. Or maybe we won't. At the very least, it will be an interesting topic to keep an eye on. All of this, of course, raises one obvious question. If this is all true, then why didn't the East fall? There are, again, no easy answers here, but there are a few broad things to keep in mind. First, there is the question of geography. The West had an incredibly long Rhine frontier and an incredibly long Danube frontier to contend with. And once any portion of those frontiers was breached, our barbarian horde could pretty much go wherever it wanted within the empire. Gaul, Spain, Italy, wherever. And after the invasion of 405, this is exactly what happened. In the East, however, once the Huns or Goths or whoever went over the river, they were confined to Thrace and Macedonia. Any attempt to cross the Hellespont, and they'd run smack into Constantinople and its impenetrable walls. Thus, the far eastern provinces of Syria and Egypt, the economic lifeblood of the Eastern Empire, were shielded from any such attack. On their eastern flank, the East dealt only with the Sassanids, a stable and civilized empire that was interested in maintaining peaceful coexistence. This allowed them to avoid the kinds of territorial sheddings that the West was forced to endure throughout the 400s, at least until the Arabs show up. Second, there is the question of relative wealth, both of the imperial government itself and the East as a whole. The military shocks that hit the West in the 400s rapidly depleted its economic output, and as barbarian nations set up autonomous zones and wealthy nobles withdrew to their estates, the central government was cut off more and more from what little wealth was available. This simply did not happen in the East. And one can never discount the vital trade link to India and China that the Eastern Empire enjoyed. A trade link that was largely severed for the West by the time the axe finally fell. In terms of its ability to support itself then, the court at Constantinople was much, much richer than the court of Ravenna. Finally, there is the question of the imperial apparatus itself. Just as the West's middle class was being killed by a combination of inflation and overtaxation, the Eastern middle class was thriving as it found itself running the now famous Byzantine bureaucracy. Whereas in the West, the super elite had withdrawn its support and resources from the government, in the East, this really did not happen, leaving imperial service as a lucrative and honorable career choice. In the West, you get the feeling that what was left of the bureaucracy was staffed by sadistic gangsters, creating a vicious cycle of disloyalty, greed, and hatred between the people and the government. Though no one ever likes a tax collector, the Eastern bureaucracy just seemed to function a whole lot better, likely because it was staffed by better paid and more talented men. In the end, this is all so much food for thought, and it will remain impossible to conclusively pinpoint the exact set of reasons why the Western Empire fell apart when it did, and why the Eastern Empire did not. Every author you read will have his or own take, and every generation will produce new evidence that discredits old theories, and then future generations will come along and discredit the even newer theories, and at some point, someone will find new evidence that supports the old theories. History is being constantly rewritten, and frankly, that is the one thing that will remain constant. Which brings me back to the present and a few thoughts on the future. First of all, just let me again express my deep, deep appreciation to everyone who has listened to the history of Rome over the years. I always tend to think of it as you guys letting me do this thing week in and week out. No audience, and I would have quit being able to justify spending so much time reading and writing and thinking about Roman history a long time ago. But you hung around in fairly large numbers, and so I got to keep doing it week after week after week. Thank you very, very much. It has been an honor and a privilege to be your guide through the endlessly fascinating history of Rome. If you've enjoyed this trip as much as I've enjoyed putting it together, and think it worth your while, I will note that there is a handy donation button at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com. It will let you quantify your appreciation in dollars and cents. Those of you who have already donated are kind of blowing my mind with your generosity, and thank you very, very much. There is no suggested donation. Give whatever you feel is right, or don't. The History of Rome is free for all, no strings attached. But if every single person who heard this episode went and donated $10, well, let's just say that it would go a long way towards relieving the financial stresses of having a newborn right at the moment when you're walking away from a project that provides a goodly chunk of your monthly income. Obviously, I am going to spend the next few months focused on the fact that, holy crap, we're having a baby. But you will be happy to hear, at least I think you'll be happy to hear. If you're not happy to hear this, then why in the world did you just spend 74 hours listening to me blabber at you about Roman history? But my plan is to return to podcasting in the not too distant future. I even know what the next show is going to be about, and I have to tell you that I'm really, really excited about it. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, because I haven't ironed out all the details in my head, but I think it's going to be really cool, and I think you'll really dig it. The only things I'll leak is that it's not going to be ancient history, and it's not going to be American history. It's going to be something else. So what you should all do is keep your subscription to the History of Rome going. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and get subscribed, because I'll use this feed to update you about future details. And we'll maybe just run the new show through that feed too, rather than trying to force everyone to jump subscriptions. I don't know. We'll see. Like I say, I haven't ironed out all the details yet. I will also keep you updated with information about any future History of Rome tour, which, like I say, are really fun, and we really want to keep doing them. So, there will be no next week, because there is no next week. Next time will be sometime down the road, and we'll be talking about something completely different. I wish you all the best of luck out there, and look forward to blathering in your ears about history again sometime soon. Goodbye. This has been The History of Rome.